you for the introduction, and thank you. It's an honor to have been invited to this international webinar, and thank you to everybody who is joining us today. I see lots of 250 plus people, so it's my pleasure to share some insights from my work over the last, let's say, 20 years. And Matthew, you mentioned Brevity and Wit, which is a firm where I'm working as a consultant for most of my time. I'll be sharing most of the work that I'm talking about today is actually coming from my work at Columbia University back in the day at the Center for Environmental Decisions, for research on environmental decisions, and then at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, both at the Earth Institute at Columbia. And at Brevity and Wit, I'm applying a lot of these insights to social justice issues, in addition to climate change information, and looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and all of that. And all of this is relevant to how are we communicating, who are our audiences, what are the barriers to decision making, and what are some of the communication principles that we can apply. And so I titled this Risk Communication, and basically what we're finding, and the reason why we're all here, is that scientific, technological views of environmental risks, in particular climate change, do usually not align with public's perceptions, the elected officials and policymakers or decision makers' perceptions of the risks associated. And because they don't align, it really affects the success and failure of our communication and the implementation of mitigation and adaptation strategies. And like Zipporah actually said earlier, it's time to get beyond educating, beyond sharing more information. It's time to motivate. And how do we motivate people? And that gets at our psychology. It's psychology of information processing and psychology of taking action. So why is information not used as intended by the people who generate the information? Well, one reason is risk perception is subjective. And I'll run through a few examples to demonstrate how subjective risk perception is in our everyday life and how that also applies to environmental risks. And then decision makers of all kinds, whether they are corporations or individuals or government or organizations or institutions, decision makers are selective when attending to information. They also evaluate options using both their cognitive and affective processes, and that gets us to the importance of emotions. We're also influenced by beliefs, values, goals, and prior experience. Worldviews, for instance, play a huge role, ideology, in the way we pay attention to information and the way we select solutions and participation and engagement in solutions. The social context within which we're operating, within which we're receiving information, and within which we make decisions plays a huge role. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about participatory processes and the value of social context. And lastly, very often we lack awareness of solutions, but also very often we don't have access to solutions. So solutions aren't set up in a way that we could actually take advantage of them. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let me dive into risk perception. And if I asked you, are you a risk seeker? And I want you to answer that in your mind. Am I a risk seeker? Yes or no? And then I want you to look through each one of these scenarios and say, do I think this action is risky? Would I engage in it? Bungee jumping, extreme mountain biking, biking in general. Do I bike in a city? Do I bike with or without a helmet? That says something about my risk perception. Smoking, being out during a major lightning storm, or chasing a tornado, or taking the preparations to protect myself and my home with a tornado shelter. Gambling, financial risks, investing, cheating on an exam or cheating on your taxes, arguing either with a partner, a friend, or speaking up to an authority Public speaking. Does it look like this, clear and focused, or does it all become a blur? These were all examples from a wide range of domains and areas that we engage in every day when it comes to taking risks. But what we see is like there's variation across individuals when it comes to taking risk and risk perception, but there's also variation within ourselves across these domains. Some of us may be totally fine taking a recreational risk, like going bungee jumping, but we would be really afraid of taking a major financial risk and investing in some options where there's a lot of uncertainty. Some of us may be totally fine smoking, but at the same time would be very, very afraid to speak up to an authority. So that's just to demonstrate risk perception matters hugely, and that informs how we pay attention to information about risks, how we process that information, and how we engage with risks. And that is kind of, in essence, this subjective perception of risk. It goes down to like risk as a feeling, which is a term that George Lowenstein coined, and also Paul Slowick, influential in this work, and really identifying the affective dimension of risk. And by affect, we mean like this can be just a faint whisper of an emotion referring to a specific quality of goodness or badness. It doesn't have to be a full-out, full-blown emotion that we're experiencing. It can be that gut feeling, or just like a sense of something being good or bad. And that influences our judgments of the riskiness of whether it's material, physical, or environmental risks. It influences what people pay attention to in a complicated situation, especially situations that decision-making under risk and uncertainty. And it then ultimately affects how people approach and solve problems. All this is to say that perceptions matter, and they often matter more than the scientific facts that we have been trying to convey for decades. Now, I want to dive a little deeper into some of these cognitive and affective processes. And what do you mean by cognitive and affective processes? The question is like, what makes you jump? And what makes you jump? I know this is an international audience, and in a lot of countries, including the US and some Western European countries, a mouse makes a lot of people jump. And we pay attention to this visceral experience rather than like to data that shows us, CO2 emissions going up and going up more and more. In other countries, this may require a snake or a spider or something else that elicits that evokes this affective response. Now, let me take this into this example of flooding. How do we express risk? Usually, in a lot of places, flood risk is expressed as a % chance of occurring in a given year. So a 1% chance, like that's what we call it, 100-year flood, which would mean like in any given year, we have 1 in 100 chance that we will experience a 100-year flood. And the next year we have that exact same chance again. And for a 500-year flood, respectively, it would be a 0.2% chance of occurring. Now, based on this statistical and this probabilistic information, does this motivate me to buy flood insurance in those countries where flood insurance exists? Does it motivate me to build a seawall? Does a government or municipality invest in a seawall? This would be like resisting the flood risk. Or do we accommodate by elevating homes? Or at what point are we talking about managed retreat to avoid this flood risk? How much do these numbers, these percentages, motivate us to do any of this? Unless you're a scientist, most people, even corporations, may not be motivated by this unless we see the destruction that comes from flooding, unless we have experienced it. We have examples here from around the world where individuals are experiencing extreme hardship, where our health is at stake, where large communities are losing their livelihood, or major infrastructure is destroyed. Seeing this, having experienced this, will motivate us more, but it may also mean that we're overestimating the risk of flooding. So there are benefits of the experience, and there are downsides of it because we may be overestimating a risk. Fortunately, we don't all have had major flood experience, but how can we create experience that motivates people? And here I want to call on the attention to the work of artists, creating experiences without creating the actual threat. This is an example of Mary Miss, who did a project in Boulder, Colorado, about 15 years ago, mapping throughout the city what a 100-year flood would look like. People experienced on their day-to-day commutes, when they're playing, when they're out on their way to work, they see these blue dots that show them where the flood level would be. This was up for 3 months and engaged the community in the process. And it's a call, not just like on artists for helping communicate the issues, but also engaging with the communities. Artists are much better at engaging communities than many scientists are. So I call for that collaboration. I've seen wonderful examples of that. So that was just like about flooding. How do we express flood risks? How do we express other risks from extreme events? Now, let me dive into for a minute into framing effects, which is a tool that we can use that actually helps audiences think about a topic through a different lens. And we can do that by changing the narrative or word choices. And one example is like a loaded topic like climate change. If we frame it as a health issue or a national security issue, a climate justice issue, an environmental stewardship issue, and many, many other ways, we may get attention from individuals, from organizations, and potentially corporations. Then there's a way to frame information by making subtle changes in wording or reference points. So do we want to talk about climate change in local terms or in global terms? We can talk about climate change actions in terms of losses and gains. We can express the same information either as losses or as gains when we talk about probabilities. So those are framing effects. And I'm going to get somewhat more practical here. For instance, with the public health frame, it can show that climate change is a concern for everyone when we highlight either children and asthma, the elderly and heat waves. And it is an opportunity to highlight the co-benefits of climate solutions by reducing emissions. We're reducing pollution, which has an effect on children's health and asthma rates. Another frame is the national security frame, which was quite successful in the United States, where the US Pentagon embraced climate change as a major issue by looking at how are their bases affected by climate change. For naval bases, does it affect military readiness, but also really auditing their own emission footprint and what that does for the military and for our climate. The climate justice issue in terms of a global climate justice frame, but also within each country. And this bottom picture is from a protest in New York, where climate justice and racial justice are the linkages are so evident and so close. Here's an example of making it local. As we saw yesterday in Tony Lazarewicz's presentation, climate change is still an issue that people perceive as distance in terms of like space and in geography and in terms of time. While everybody believes climate change is happening, unless you're experiencing the extreme events associated with it, you still believe that you are safe. So how can we bring the message close to home, bringing the local impacts close to home, but also highlighting local solutions, even though many solutions happen at a much broader scale. And Zipporah has pointed this out. We need to shift back from the individual to the actual corporate responsibility. But in order for people to engage with that and march for your fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, we need to translate data into locally meaningful action so that people get engaged and see why they need to speak up. And here is an example of how to do this. So extreme heat waves in the northeastern US, you can express this as like that warming will occur in as much as like 3.1 degree Fahrenheit in this case, and show a map. But how does that translate into the number of heat days over 95 degrees in the city of New York? It goes up from 10 to 30 days in only 8 years. And then put a number onto which populations are especially vulnerable to suffering from heat waves because they don't have access to air conditioning or other ventilation. It's like more than 500,000 people and growing. So putting numbers and putting meaningful examples, meaningful translations of these numbers into your communication. Similarly, a state park in Maine, the northeastern US, by 2100, summers in Arcadia National Park are projected to be 10 degrees hotter. That's a heat that people have a hard time maybe feeling when they see this. But what does it mean for your outdoor activities when mosquito days go up from 70 days to over 100 days? How does that affect transmission of disease? And if you're not worried about disease, it's just a plain nuisance. So translating that into something like into that in a way it affects activities that people engage in that are meaningful to people. Similarly, what variables are we selecting in our communication? What variables are most important to people? With typhoons and hurricanes, we focus a lot on wind speed that makes them a category 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. But we often neglect the torrential downpours that occur not just on the coastline, but sometimes 100 and 200 miles inland, which we need to be prepared for and pay attention to. All of this is like this framing helps us, like when people have a finite pool of worry, elected officials have a finite pool of worry. We're worried about the economy. We're worrying about coronavirus. I need to Photoshop a coronavirus into this image. We're worried about terrorism. We're worrying about gun violence in this country in particular. How much more can we worry about? But with framing, we're able to show that each one of these issues has a connection to climate change. And we need to think holistically and we need to connect the dots. Just one other thing, like lessons learned from our work, is like that we need to lead with solutions. When people are overwhelmed with a problem, such as climate change, which is a massive problem, it can lead to paralysis. But knowing that there are solutions makes us more likely to accept the existence of a problem. So I encourage everybody to lead with solutions. And if you can't lead with solutions, at least pair any impacts that you're talking about with solutions. That instills a sense of efficacy, and that is empowering. And it reorients people toward action and opportunity, which then abates feelings of hopelessness and dread. And giving people the sense of personal and collective efficacy determines how they respond to information, how they determine should I be engaged in this cause. And then it gives people the sense of being part of a larger solution and greater overall support of a cause and ultimately collective action. And then many solutions have co-benefits that we need to highlight as well to get more people on board. So, but in this, it's also really important that you know your audience, that you translate the information in something that's actionable and appropriate for them, and whether that's a corporation or a small community. And as I said, leading with solutions can increase your message and information reception. And we want to highlight the impact of small actions, even though we also need big actions. And actually, to Tzipora's point, behavioral science is admitting now that they have bought into like working on the individual actions, and that it has actually affected or has been to the detriment of looking for bigger action. But small action is important. There's a lot of psychological benefit to that. So we want the actions to match the impact scale and lead times of whatever we're planning for, or extreme events, for instance, and we want them to match the decision-making capacity, financially, the human capacity, and then the structural issues that may be underlying. And when we're talking about solutions, we really want to make sure we're avoiding a single action bias. And that is a tendency to engage in just one single corrective or protective action to remove our perceived threats. And that can be detrimental because we think we changed our light bulbs to compact fluorescent bulbs. And here we are, like then we're blowing our air conditioner, or we make up for it in other ways. So we need to engage in a whole portfolio of actions that need to be present in our mind. And that means we need to know our audience. What does our audience care about? Is our audience's capacity to respond? And that we can do through participatory processes, so we can tailor our communication. And I just have like a couple slides on that. What I mean by participatory processes means like we need to determine all relevant audiences and parties, all the stakeholders, and include stakeholders who don't think like you. Don't include just the usual suspects, and ask around the table who is missing at the table. And then we can learn from each other in a reciprocal relationship between scientists, practitioners, the public, and any other stakeholders that are involved. We want to translate research into usable recommendations for our stakeholders, and then distill, evaluate, update, and repeat. And this is a long process. This is not something we have an idea, we have a solution, this is what you need, and we go in and want to implement. These are year-long processes, sometimes 10-year-long processes to build the trust with the communities, with the stakeholders, and sometimes those are corporations, sometimes they are elected officials with whom we can then work. And what this does, actually, by creating participatory processes, it creates this social context. It needs to be started early, and it needs to be an inclusive engagement. Participation in problem identification and brainstorming of solutions. And this social context, by being gathered between like two or more people, it alters the way in which people acquire, learn, engage with, and act on information. That's a huge insight from social psychology. And being in a group activates social and thereby environmental goals. Let me just sum up with like, know your audience. It's the most common sense thing of communication, the number one rule, but it's so often neglected. But when we do it right, we connect with our audience, we can tailor the information, and become equal partners in the process. And ask yourself, is my message relatable? Does it relate to the person that I'm talking to? Does it relate to their most pressing priorities? Does it grab attention? We want a balance that's vivid enough, but not alarmist. Does it motivate action by leading with solution, by translating solutions into actionable and appropriate steps? And really, we want to emphasize the impact of taking action and what that means in terms of empowerment. And then ultimately, does it foster cooperation, collaboration, and community building, which are so important if we want to build a resilient society? And how can we tap into a sense of group affiliation? What do we have in common, and what shared future do we see? And let me end with like a couple of resources. The Psychology of Climate Change Communication, which was a guide that came out in 2009 and is still incredibly relevant. We did not think that would be the case when we created this over 13 years ago. And I'm so excited to say that this guide has been translated into Portuguese, thanks to the tremendous work of Renzo Tadei at the Federal University of Sao Paulo, who used to work with us at CRED. And then 2014, we worked together with Eco America on a guide that is an additional guide. The two of them work nicely together, connecting on climate. And with that, I'm afraid I went over time, but I'm happy to hand it back to the hosts and happy to answer any questions if we have time later.